Good evening, everyone. So I'm Justin Citron, and we'll each introduce ourselves, but first I'll tell you a little bit about our center. So the Center for Human Sexuality Studies at Widener, we've been at Widener, we celebrate our 20th year this year. Before coming to Widener, the program was at the University of Pennsylvania in the Graduate School of Education there for about 25 years. And so we have a long history, and many of the founders of our program trace their own learning histories back through, all the way back to Kinsey, if you kind of follow the different generations of sexuality researchers. And we're one of the only doctoral programs in the country. We also have a master's program, and our students can choose between different tracks of study where they can choose either sexuality education, sex therapy, public policy, or nonprofit management. And then our doctoral program trains in sexuality research. So that's just a little bit about our center, who we are. My background and area of expertise or specialization is in program development, sexuality education. I have a background as a school teacher and then a community health educator. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about sort of what this work of Kinsey means to me now in a few minutes, but I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Wells. I'm the director of the PhD program at Widener University. And my background is actually in social psychology, and most of my research prior to coming to Widener has been around HIV. One of the things that really resonated with me in the movie was our kind of continued focus on the very medical end of things within sexuality research and education. I think we still struggle to talk about relationships, and we still definitely don't really know how to measure love. So that's still an issue for us. So my work now is mostly around sexual cultures and communities, as well as the connections between substances and sexuality.
Hello, everybody. I figured we'd just grab some chairs and have a more informal conversation, because after watching such a lovely film and talking about such an intimate subject, y'all are my people, right? So we family, we can have a conversation. My name is Javante Williams. I'm an applied research scientist in the Center for Human Sexuality Studies, but I work in a particular unit called the Interdisciplinary Sexuality Research Collaborative, which is on my shirt if I forget where I work. And what we do is use the same tools and resources that are at Widener through the faculty and the resources on campus, and we look outward into the community. So we go into Chester, we go into places like Baltimore and to Jackson. Currently, I manage a grant which is the largest private grant given to Widener, nearly $962,000, to focus on sex education for Black gay men living in Baltimore, Maryland, and Jackson, Mississippi. Because so much of what Kinsey started still exists in terms of a need to understand and educate people about their sexuality, but how that sexuality ties into their everyday life. And so that's the project I work on at Widener, in addition to supporting some of the other things that the faculty are doing. I also teach one class in the summer called Sexual Minorities, which focuses on queer people.
Brooke,
Sure,
do you want
I'll
to talk?
talk a little bit about some of my research, especially as it ties into the movie. Some of you may have heard a little bit about some of the research that's been coming out in the last few years that people are having less sex than they have in previous generations. That is some of my work. I sometimes call myself the Debbie Downer of sex research, of just letting you know we're not doing it anymore, everyone go home. And that's a wild exaggeration. We are definitely still doing it, it being all sorts of things. And I think we're still really searching for that normal. We want to know what everybody else is doing to figure out where we fit into that and what we look like compared to other people. So that has been, some of my work has been HIV research and prevention and stuff that I think about as very important in the world. And what has gotten the most media attention is who's having the sex, how much of it are they having, does it look like what I am doing? And the question that I get asked most often about that decline in sex that we're seeing is it bad or is it good? Right? And we don't know the answer to that. It's probably yes, both, right? There are probably some folks who are having less sex because maybe they never wanted to have it in the first place, or they are waiting, or they're finding lots of other fulfilling things in their lives. And then there is often the panic about Facebook and cell phones and all of the things that are potentially keeping us from being intimate with one another. So that is definitely the part that resonated with me the most, that we are still searching for normal. And I put giant air quotes around that.
So in thinking about normal and in the sexuality education space, the digital environment that our young people are growing up in really has changed not so much what people talk about or what people do, but the ways in which they do it. There's folks at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard who've done survey research and some interviewing with young people trying to better understand what it is they want to understand about sexuality, and so much of it has to do with what does love look like? How do I know it if I have it? And they really want people to not just talk to them about sex because they feel like they can find information about sex pretty much anywhere. But how do we talk about relationships? How do we know if the relationship that they have is a good one? Which actually echoes a lot of what we hear in the community when we talk to, some of the work I do in Chester is with pediatricians at the Crozier Keystone Chester Medical Center. And they can talk about the disease issues and they can talk about pregnancy and contraception, but when it comes to talking to young people about consent, about finding the relationship that they want, about knowing whether or not the relationship they have is a safe, comfortable one, those things are really hard and people have a difficult time talking about them. And a lot of it's because of what we saw echoed in Kinsey's work now, 80 years ago, where people are so afraid to say these words and talk about it that they just avoid it altogether. I think it's notable that some of the challenges that kind of surfaced in their team and that we see, I think, rippling today in sexuality researchers is these relationships that we all as researchers can objectify or become as objective as we can to the things we study, but ultimately these things affect all of us deeply as well.
One of the things that was interesting in the film for me is like it could have been a filming of any day at my job because like issues of funding, issues of controversy and what you can and cannot say and how you can present it, those challenges still exist in a very distinct way when it comes to talking about intimacy, sexuality, and people's connections to each other. Particularly when you start adding things that are already taboo in mainstream society, like queer sex, like people of color, and as a black man, am I the only one? Yes, score. And then cry. But in the film, there was a comment about, especially the Negro race and lower class. Like that whole mystique is still present. It's very much with us. It manifests in different ways. And so I was shocked at how similar the challenges are in the film to our current challenges.
I agree. And I think some of the power is also still there. That last clip when the woman says that he saved her life by putting that information out there, it gives me chills again to talk about it. And teaching human sexuality, that is something that you hear from people, that piece of information changed everything, changed the way I look at gender, changed the way I look at my family, my relationships. I joke that now I mostly teach statistics and research methods, so I don't quite have the same impact on folks in that way, but those moments are so powerful, and sometimes they can be as simple as information, as understanding, and as hearing those questions and those concerns in that non-judgmental way to really accept where people are and give them the information that they need without making them feel embarrassed or shamed.
So we thought we would give you all a chance to ask us questions about the things. We could sit up here and talk all night for hours
Really,
about
we
the
could.
things we care about. But we thought it might be the best to give you all an opportunity to ask us some questions, and we can do our best to help
There's a question right here.
folks understand.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, from your knowledge of Kinsey, obviously the movie is presenting a very narrow slice of his work. But what are some things that stand out for you as things that he got right and things that he got wrong?
Well, certainly the Kinsey scale is something, especially in the LGBTQ movement, has largely been used, I would say, especially the last 30 years, to really help define the continuum between heterosexual and homosexual. And I think Kinsey really offered that in a place where there was nothing, just to sort of give us a place to figure out where we stand in comparison to others. I think the challenge with his model is it's so behavioral focused. And most of Kinsey's work, I mean, he was a biologist and he was really interested in behavior and he tried to be so objective. And what got lost in that was the human experience of those things, which I think we see play out in the film, the way it's told here. But I think that scale is still used today, and it's basically the foundation of any other scale that's ever been developed to help us measure or describe people's sexual attraction in that continuum sort of way. I would say there's about 3 others that have tried to do it, and now there's a new one called sexual configurations theory, which is trying to take us beyond the gender of our partners and who we're attracted to, but also look at how does our gender identity play into that? How does our level of interest in sex at all play into that? How does our interest in things that are non-human play into that? And so is really pushing the envelope now to try to help us think about it, but I would say that's probably, from my perspective, one of his biggest contributions.
Do you want to answer that question? So I am not trained formally in like the discipline of sexuality and sexology. My discipline is sociology, and for 15 years before coming to Widener, I took care of elderly patients who would fall down, break their hip, we'd repair them, and they'd go home. My interest in sexuality comes from the intersection of understanding what happens to us as we age, right? What does that mean for our sexuality? Because what we're understanding is that our sexuality has such an impact on so many parts of our life. Who you love will determine your outcomes in many ways, particularly those determinants of health that are connected to sexuality. And so we're seeing this most readily with people and HIV. But there are so many other things. If your partner cooks high cholesterol food for you, you are going to end up with sexually contracted heart disease. That's not a thing. That's not a thing. That's not a thing. Not that way. But I think from my colleagues who have a critique of Kinsey, similar to as Dr. Citron was explaining, he was so focused on the biology that what gets lost is that human experience and that contextualization of, okay, beyond the orgasm and the anatomy, what is sexuality to any individual? And the lack of sex, or people who do not choose to engage in sex, like what do those things mean? And as diverse as the film portrayed his interviews to be, what is factual, and you all know this better than I do, is that it was not a very diverse population that he interviewed. And so there's so many other things to be learned about different populations that we researchers that followed Kinsey have only begun to scratch the surface of.
How about another one? Yeah.
I just wonder if you have thoughts on how he really involved himself and his family in the study, and even Masters and Johnson, it's the same kind of thing. And if you think that influenced what he was looking for or how he found it.
Absolutely. So I think this is still a really controversial thing that that researchers still talk about all the time. It's a question that we often get, or an assumption that people often make about us, is that we must be involved, our lives must be some crazy orgy all the time, right? I often joke that I spend so much time thinking and writing about sex that, but I think that we have a lot more ethical standards in place now than were in place at that time. Thankfully. So I think we certainly see less of that, and I think we see a lot of disapproval within the field of that, because sexuality researchers have had to fight so hard to be taken seriously and to be considered legitimate scientists. I think many of us have really sort of worked hard to separate in a lot of ways, or to kind of maintain a very professional front on that. So,
and I think at the same time, and I try to compel my students to think about, while we have ethical standards and IRBs and things in place to try to help us stay on a good path that treats the people that we do research with well, in 50 years, we're going to look back to today and have new insights then that we are doing things now we should not do. And so I think the humility that we enter the research space with is essential to our being productive. But I do think that by trying to make as scientific as possible the study of sex, there's a whole breadth of topics that we just don't study. And I say we, meaning like the field of sexuality. And I think a lot of times the topics that do get studied are really driven, like me search is research or research is me search. Like I think a lot of times what does get selected to be studied is really driven by a cisgender, white, male, heterosexual perspective. And I think as the field, like psychology, sociology, biology, public health have sort of help diversify us a little bit, I still think there is so much that we just have not even explored or we have withheld access to certain folks from doing the science. One of our colleagues and researchers in the ISRC, Tracy Gilbert, has just finished her dissertation and is working on an epistemology of Black sexuality that really looks at moving away from a problematized way of thinking about Black sexuality and more looking at, like, if we talk to Black folks about sexiness, what do we look at? And as a Black woman herself, she has access to a conversation that I don't have access to and that our field really hasn't prioritized because it wasn't part of solving HIV. It wasn't part of, having people use contraceptives more often. And a lot of those things are the things that have driven our field. And so I think we're trying, at least in our center, to open the doors a little bit more and to encourage people to pursue really like places no one has even really written about. And it's been exciting to see some of the things our students and our colleagues are doing.
So I'm interested in this study you just mentioned, and is that focusing on Black folks in North America? 'Cause
Yeah, she interviewed folks all around the United States, but within the United States. Yeah. And her name is
my
Tracy
parents
Gilbert.
Live in Africa.
Okay.
And so the kind of differences or
Sure.
subtle gradations, and obviously it's a continent, it's huge, it's full of people, there's a lot of difference there, but for a lot of my Black American friends being there, it was very confusing to see where things overlapped and where things were very different.
Sure.
Other question?
Are you aware if disability was featured in any Kinsey studies and toxicity studies?
I don't know about disability within Kinsey's work. I'm not sure about that. But there is definitely a chunk of people who are studying disability now in sexuality in a variety of different ways. So there is an old piece by a guy named Mitch Tepper looking at the missing discourse of desire in disability studies in particular. That tends to be an area where people are very focused on the medical and kind of push away the sexual and the relational and really prioritize the medical care. And how could you even be thinking about sex when we're trying to help you with this very serious medical thing, right? So I think there is more research happening now and more thought and more openness around that. Yeah, that's a great question.
In the back?
How about surrogacy at Kinsey? Let's talk about that. I'm sex therapist. My people are lighter too, some of the people that I work with.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that?
Sure, sexual surrogacy, I assume you're talking about, right? Yeah.
So, well, there's a lot of different language that people use, but surrogate partners are folks. Well, so one of the first things I can say to destigmatize it, so surrogate partners are folks that therapists often will work with because of the history of our field and the medicalization of it and the scientificization of it. Sex therapists and any therapist that works in sexuality area are barred by most ethical codes by not touching their clients. And what we know is that not everybody can just sit in a room and talk about something and learn how to do it. We wouldn't expect people to learn about meditation by watching a film and then go home and meditate. We want to help them practice. And so surrogate partners are folks that will work with patients and do hands-on type work. It's controversial among sex therapists. It's controversial among sexuality educators. But there are a lot of people who have really made great progress in pursuing that type of care. And I tend to liken it to massage therapy because it is body work, massage therapy, physical therapy. Those are all people whose professions require, and it's typical for them to touch their clients or their patients' bodies as part of their provision of care. And when it comes to sexuality, there are a lot of people who report getting a lot out of hands-on work. The biggest thing I would just destigmatize that from the folks that I know that either work with surrogates or who do surrogate work themselves, that oftentimes what they're doing is a lot of just like the laying of hands, learning how to interact with another person's body, going on dates. And so the sexual intercourse part of surrogacy work is really rare. And the goal is that people who are engaging with a surrogate, their goal is not to have sex with a surrogate partner. Their goal is to have sex with the people that they want to partner with in their daily life. And so the surrogate's job is to help them get to that place. But for a lot of folks, especially folks with trauma or abuse histories, just holding hands, being held, being in a bed together, like some of those very basic sexuality sort of needs that we see Kinsey and his wife laying in bed for the first time, and they're not even nude or even close to nude, and that the anxiety of that really does get in folks' way. And so surrogate partners can often help sort of ease people into becoming more physically intimate.
In the beginning of his research was very surrogate-like.
Yeah, a lot of,
It was, and there was no emotion
Right.
at all with the people because sex is an emotion.
mhm.
And this is science, what he is presenting to us. But I really felt that each and every case that he was going through in there was almost very surrogate-like.
Yeah,
Like especially with his wife. You know, they were afraid, it was the first time they're being touched.
sure.
And very tantric. I'm a tantra teacher, like, can I touch you?
Yeah,
You know, where the questions were just starting to surface into the next where we are now.
mhm.
You know, of the relationship that you talked about. And then now, of course, we had sexual revolution and the emotion, that sex is really an emotion, it's not a science. We've come so far.
Yeah.
But that reminded me just very much of a whole way of the way a surrogate would approach everything, touch,
Yeah.
and, afraid to touch or learning how to be touched. But anyway.
Did you have a hand up?
I did at one point. If anyone else has a question, please feel free.
I think how much time do we have?
Okay, I'll just ask.
Yeah.
Obviously, back in his time, the technology wasn't really there to do kind of anything related to reaching so many more millions of people. I was wondering if you could talk about how the broader technology, like internet access, Google, has been able to help your research and kind of new insights you've been able to glean now that that tool is there.
Sure.
That's a great question. That's a really good
Yeah.
question.
So I think from a research perspective, as you note, the internet has been huge. We can do surveys online now and get thousands of people. We just had a student do a survey about sleep orgasms, and she surveyed 2,000 people across the country about sleep orgasms. So, and I think she did that in like 2 months. So definitely technology helps with that. For me, some of the really interesting stuff that's happening around technology is some of the research on some of sort of the back-end Google data in terms of what people are searching for, some of the information that we've been able to glean from online dating or hookup apps, and in terms of how people are navigating those on the back end, what that actually turns into in real time kind of thing. So I think that's really insightful because it gives us a sense of what people are looking for, maybe more privately, maybe what they wouldn't say if you were actually asking them. But I definitely think in terms of the anonymity that some of the internet research can give people, that can be really helpful. It was very interesting at the beginning when they were saying like, oh, surveys feel too much like exams for people. You have to sit in front of them and ask them the questions. And as a researcher, I was like, oh, that seems way harder than just sending out a survey. Gosh. So I definitely think that has changed. It's been a game changer for us.
And I would add to that, a part of our project with sex education for Black gay men in Baltimore and Jackson involves a smartphone app called the Journey app. And so it supports digital support groups, which is something probably the Kinsey team couldn't have dreamed about, that people would have an environment on their phone to have private video chat conversations about sex and sexuality. And so the way I describe it is, it's like a house, and you go into all these different rooms, and in any room, you can have a different conversation, right? And so there's a facilitator on the one side that gives actionable science, empirical information, not just willy-nilly, I Googled this and this is true, but it's empirical scientific information about sex. And on the other side, there are consumers who are across the country who have the opportunity to engage with that content. That is a different way of presenting sex education. It's a more interactive way. I think about Google, like some of my earlier days in Google. Those websites don't exist anymore, one. But two, it's really interesting what surfaces in Google. And I think just now are we starting to understand that we need to regulate this process, because that process can easily be hacked and people can get a lot of bad information. What was the thing that came out a couple years ago that people were Googling? It was something about blue something or something.
Oh, blue waffles.
Blue waffles and other stuff that doesn't even relate to sexuality. And people take that information, and because it comes from the magic box in front of their face, they take it as science, and we have to counter that. So,
yeah, and I think there's a study out of Great Britain, but they found that between 9 and 11 years old, almost every child has seen some kind of sexually explicit media, almost always on someone else's device, which whether they report that it's on someone else's device or was actually on someone else's device. But I think just that statistic, I was recently talking with a friend of mine who's a parent, thinking about when I was 9 to 11, that was just not, you had to work to find somebody's stash, right? But what we have then is this surge of information online that anybody has access to, but teaching people to critically analyze, understand, and decide which thing to pay attention to. A group of my students and I were talking about working with the pediatricians to help them teach parents how to find reliable resources online. And what we found is there's just as many sexuality information websites as there are points of view about sex in the world. And as a parent, it's overwhelming if you don't know the information yourself to decide, is this website over here the one I should be using to talk to my children, or is this the one? And so I think as much as there's more information, we have more access, there's still a lot of challenges that we haven't really figured out. And when I think about research, there's been sort of a surgence in a prioritizing of rural America. And how much does the internet give us access to folks from a research perspective, right? Anybody with a device who get a survey link can take the survey. But there's some presumptions behind that. They have to have access to that device. That device has to be available to them in a place that's private enough they would do the sex research survey. Do they have broadband access to the internet? And we're realizing that there is a whole part of the country that really the internet is not accessible. It's not a basic human part of their daily life. And so that really does impact who takes our surveys and who looks at our research. And I think that's, on behalf of scientists, work that we have to do to sort of unpack and find ways to make sure that we are actually connecting to everybody and not just saying that now that we can get thousands, we've got a good number, right? Where are those thousands coming from? Maybe one more?
So I'll ask a question, which is kind of the framing for our discussion. Where do you two see sex research going from here into the future?
Well, I think it's more critical now than ever before that we get this research out into the world. I think one of the things that's always challenging, as we see in the Kinsey film, is what happens to our findings once they go to the media, to the world, to wherever. I published something once showing that women's sexuality had changed more than men's sexuality had over the course of years. And in a New York Daily paper, the headline was "Girls Gone Wild," which was not at all what I was trying to say with that. So I think one of our challenges and sort of where we're going is going to be really thinking about what we need to inform policy, and what we need to do that in a very intentional and thoughtful way that is much more attentive to a larger swath of people than we've typically looked at. So much of sexuality research is white college women. And that's a very convenient, easy population to get, and I think it's just not good enough. And so I think our challenge is going to be to move beyond that and to really be intentional and thoughtful about how we apply that research in the world.
So I think, from my perspective, in the polarized time we're in, so one of my particular areas other than programming is sexual diversity and sort of how we interact with people whose perspectives on sex or sexuality are different than our own. And there's some interesting theories that kind of explain that we all navigate difference in a set of patterns. But we've been in a place for a really long time where we're focused on like differences are bad and problematic, or differences are something we should not pay attention to and instead find our common humanity, which I think is great. But I think that the last point Brooke was making is like, but who is us? Like who are this common group of people that we think about? And I think a colleague of mine had once said that why do we say human sexuality and not just sexuality? It's like, well, because all creatures on Earth almost all have some kind of sexuality or asexuality, right? But human sexuality is a unique thing that we have as a species. And I think we have to do a better job finding where our sexuality can bring us together and to figure out where the differences are that matter. So people have been studying like gender differences in sexuality for decades. And what we find in most studies is that gender really isn't that helpful of a variable to look at about how we're different. And there's a lot of other things like that that really aren't that helpful, but yet we're fixed on them. And I think we need to do a better job looking, and the future of sex science is really looking at like what are the differences that do matter and what are the commonalities that we're totally missing out on that would get us away from some of the polarized policy things and get us more towards like sexuality is a human right that we all should have access to and enjoy and do what we want with. Anyhow, so that's kind of where I think it will go. What about you?
Thank you for asking me that.
You're welcome.
I think that, like, as you said, differences need to be taken into account, but I also feel like it's a lifespan approach, a life course approach that we need to adopt, because right now we know that people are living a lot longer. One of my best friends is 90, a fierce, fabulous gay man, and still lives alone, still drives. He is living well. What type of information do we know about him from the literature? Like, what would I be able to speak about if I wrote a paper and said, this is how black gay men age? Very little, unless he was living with HIV, because the funding's not there, the interest hasn't been there. But what we also know is that half the world right now, according to most statistics, is under the age of 40. And so you combine that with people living longer, and a lot of young folks, we're in for a really, really wild ride. And now I feel like it's the time to move our consciousness into understanding that sex is something that happens over the life course, not just something that you need to be educated about in adolescence and then reintroduced to in marriage, if that's what your life course dictates, and then something that you're done with kind of around menopause and life crisis. No, this is an iterative process that is continuing a learning process, right? And so I think that having that approach is going to enrich us all as a society, as a people, as a culture, as a species. Done.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Philadelphia Film Society.